In one small city in eastern China, a single production cluster turns out more finished spectacle lenses before lunch than most countries manage in a week. That city is called Danyang, and it sits quietly inside Jiangsu Province, home to fewer than 1 million people, roughly a 25-minute high-speed train ride from Nanjing. Right now, as you read this, there is close to a 50% chance that the lenses in your own glasses, or your neighbors, or your teachers, were ground, polished, and coated somewhere inside this one small patch of land. That is not a rounding error or a marketing exaggeration. That is half the eyeglass lenses on planet Earth, coming from a place most people outside the optical industry have never once heard of. Here is the part that sounds almost impossible. On the other side of the world, one giant company built from a French lens maker and an Italian frame maker pulls in close to $28 billion a year, and industry analysts have estimated it touches somewhere around 80% of global eyewear production, from the frame on your face to the very store where you bought it. And yet, in that same industry, at the same moment in history, you can now order a complete pair of prescription glasses online from China for around $9, shipped straight to your door. Somehow, both of those facts are true at exactly the same time, in the exact same global market. By the end of this video, you will understand exactly how a manufacturing town most people cannot even find on a map is quietly cracking open one of the most locked down, most tightly controlled consumer industries on the planet, and what that shift actually means for the price of the glasses sitting on your own face right now. If the idea of one hidden company controlling something you rely on every single day catches your attention, you might enjoy sticking around for this one, because this channel exists to dig into exactly these kinds of hidden industrial stories, the ones hiding in plain sight behind ordinary products. Hitting subscribe simply means you will not miss the next one when it drops, and honestly, once you start noticing these hidden supply chains, it is hard to stop. To understand why this shift matters so much, you first need to understand just how strange and locked down the eyewear business became over the last few decades. Glasses look like a simple product on the surface. 2 lenses, a frame, a couple of hinges, done. But the industry that grew up around that simple object turned into one of the most tightly controlled consumer markets anywhere in the world, and almost nobody outside the industry noticed it happening. It started with 2 separate companies, each dominant in its own lane. One was Essilor, a French firm that had spent generations perfecting the science and chemistry of prescription lenses. The other was Luxottica, an Italian company that made frames and, just as importantly, had spent decades quietly buying up the actual stores where those frames were sold. In 2018, these 2 companies merged in a deal worth close to $49 billion, creating a single, combined giant, EssilorLuxottica, that could design a lens, manufacture the frame, license the name from a fashion house, ship the finished product, and then sell it to you inside a store that it also happened to own. Think about what that really means for a normal shopper walking into a mall. If one company owns the factory that makes the lens, owns the license to stamp a name like Chanel or Prada onto the frame, and also owns Lens Crafters or Sunglass Hut, the store you are standing inside of, there is no real competition happening in front of you at all. You believe you are choosing between different brands. In reality, you are mostly choosing between different logos owned by the very same parent company, priced however that company decides is appropriate. For decades, if you wanted eyewear that looked stylish and felt well made, there was almost no way around this system. Independent opticians still existed, but many of them still had to buy their lenses, their frames, or both, from inside this same giant supply chain, because the alternative manufacturers simply could not match the price, the speed, or the sheer variety on offer. Financial reporting on the company has repeatedly used words like near monopoly, and regulators in both the United States and Europe have opened investigations into just how concentrated this market had become. Nobody solved this problem for a long time for one very simple reason, which is that making a genuinely good lens is hard, in ways that are easy to underestimate from the outside. Grinding curved resin or glass down to an exact prescription, coating it so it resists scratches, tinting it evenly, shaping it precisely enough to click into a frame without distorting the wearer's vision, all of that takes specialized equipment, tightly controlled chemistry, and years of accumulated factory experience that cannot simply be copied overnight. New competitors kept appearing over the decades, and most of them either got quietly acquired, priced out, or simply could not match the speed and cost of a company that already owned every single link in the chain, from raw material to retail counter. Breaking into eyewear was never like breaking into, say, phone cases or t-shirts. You needed an actual lens factory, and lens factories were expensive to build, slow to get running properly, and brutally hard to run at real scale without decades of accumulated know-how behind you. This is exactly the wall that Danyang started quietly climbing, one small family workshop at a time, back when almost nobody outside China was paying any attention at all. It helps to understand who actually built the empire on the other side of this story. The driving force behind Luxottica for decades was a man named Leonardo Del Vecchio, who started out as a young metalworker making small parts for eyeglass frames, and eventually built one of the most quietly powerful companies in the entire fashion world. Under his leadership, Luxottica did not just make frames, it steadily bought its way into owning the actual stores where those frames were sold, and then bought its way into owning the licenses for major fashion brands as well. By the time Essilor and Luxottica merged in 2018, the resulting company was not just large, it was structured so that almost nobody, anywhere in the supply chain, could easily route around it. That kind of structure takes decades to build on purpose, and it is exactly the kind of structure that a scattered group of small, independent lens makers in China had no realistic way of challenging directly, at least not without finding an entirely different way to compete. The story of Danyang does not start with laser-guided machines or $9 glasses shipped worldwide. It starts far more humbly, in the 1950s and 60s, with what local histories still describe as thatched hut-style workshops, small family operations grinding lenses by hand in conditions that would look nothing like a modern factory. For years, this stayed a small regional trade, useful locally but invisible globally. Then, in the 1990s, the city made a hard, deliberate pivot toward resin lenses, the lightweight plastic style that was starting to replace heavy glass lenses around the world. That single shift mattered enormously because resin was cheaper to produce at scale, far easier to coat and tint consistently, and much more comfortable for a wearer than the thick glass lenses that had come before it. Danyang leaned into that shift hard, and small workshops slowly began merging and scaling into genuine factories. Here is where an everyday analogy makes this easier to picture. Imagine a small town that starts out with a handful of family bakeries, each one baking its own bread from scratch, by hand, independently of every other bakery in town. Over the following decades, instead of staying scattered and separate, the entire town gradually specializes. One business focuses only on running the ovens efficiently. Another focuses only on sourcing and refining the flour. Another focuses only on packaging, labeling, and shipping loaves out the door as fast as possible. Eventually, the whole town functions as one giant, tightly coordinated bread-making machine, one where every single business feeds directly into every other business nearby, and together they can outproduce a bakery 10 times their individual size, located anywhere else on Earth. That is essentially what happened inside Danyang, except instead of bread, the product was lenses. Today, the city hosts more than 1,600 separate enterprises connected to the eyewear industry, employing well over 50,000 people, nearly all of it clustered into a few square miles of factories, warehouses, and workshops. The next stage of the process is the part that genuinely sounds like science fiction, and it is where this story stops being about cheap labor and starts being about real technology. In recent years, some manufacturers inside Danyang started borrowing a technique directly from computer chip factories, a process called lithography, to shape lenses with extreme, almost microscopic precision. Picture it like the difference between cutting a shape freehand with scissors versus using a laser-guided stencil that repeats the exact same cut, perfectly, tens of thousands of times in a row, without ever drifting off the line. In chip making, lithography is used to etch patterns onto silicon wafers that are far too small and far too precise for any human hand to manage. Applying a version of that same idea to eyewear lets manufacturers take a very thick, very strong prescription lens and cut it down to just a couple of millimeters in thickness, while keeping the curve and the optical clarity exactly correct. That single leap is the real difference between the thick, heavy Coke bottle glasses people wore decades ago and the thin, light, almost invisible lenses people expect as completely normal today. Once the raw lens shape itself is solved, the rest of the process becomes almost entirely about speed, coordination, and logistics between hundreds of specialized businesses. A rough lens blank first gets shaped to match an exact individual prescription. It then gets edged and trimmed to fit a specific frame style precisely, down to the millimeter. After that, it moves to coating, where a scratch-resistant layer, an anti-glare layer, or a blue light filtering layer might all be applied in sequence, depending on what the customer ordered. Only after all of that is it packaged and shipped, sometimes moving between 3 or 4 different specialized companies inside Danyang alone, before it ever reaches an export dock bound for another country. Because so many of these individual steps happen within just a few miles of each other, sometimes even within the same industrial park, the entire cycle, from raw material to a finished lens ready to be worn on someone's face on the other side of the planet, can move dramatically faster than in a country where those same steps are spread across different states, different regions, or even different continents entirely. That speed is a genuine competitive weapon, not just a nice bonus. Speed like that is extremely difficult for anyone to copy from scratch, because it is not really one factory's advantage, it is the accumulated advantage of an entire town's worth of specialized businesses that learn to work together like gears inside a single enormous machine over the course of 70 years. So how exactly do you compete with a cluster that took 7 decades to build layer by layer? In most cases, you simply cannot, not unless you already happen to have one sitting there yourself. Now let's ground all of this in real, checkable numbers, because a story like this only means something once the specific details actually hold up under scrutiny. According to Chinese state media reporting from 2024, Danyang produces more than 400 million spectacle lenses every single year. That figure accounts for somewhere between 70 and 80% of China's entire domestic lens production, and roughly 50% of the entire world's lens supply, depending on exactly which year and which reporting agency you happen to check. The city is officially nicknamed the capital of glasses inside China, and it sits administratively within Zhenjiang City in Jiangsu Province, just that short, high-speed train ride away from Nanjing. Local industry groups reported that in 2022 alone, taxable sales inside Danyang's eyewear manufacturing sector reached roughly 12.23 billion yuan, translating to close to 1.7 billion US dollars at the time, marking an increase of 8.66% compared with the year before. Export figures tell a similarly striking story. Danyang's own local eyewear chamber of commerce reported that the city's glasses exports reached around 661 million US dollars in 2022, following an 18.61% jump the year before that, even in the middle of significant global supply chain disruption caused by COVID. Named companies operating inside this cluster include Wanxin Optics, one of the oldest continuously running eyewear manufacturers in China, and Mingyue Optical Lens Company, which industry reporting has described as running what are sometimes called dark factories, meaning fully automated production lines that can keep running with the lights essentially off, needing barely any human hands on the floor at all to keep the machines moving. This is not a rumor passed around online forums. This is documented, government-tracked, statistically measured industrial activity, reported repeatedly by state media over multiple separate years. Meanwhile, on the other end of this comparison, EssilorLuxottica has never really hidden its own scale either, since public financial disclosures make it easy to check. Public reporting puts the company's annual revenue at roughly 26.5 billion euros, close to 28 or 29 billion US dollars depending on the exchange rate used, with a total market value well north of $100 billion. Financial analysts covering the company have estimated its share of global eyewear manufacturing at somewhere around 80%, and its share of the North American optical retail market at close to 50% as well. The company owns Ray-Ban, Oakley, LensCrafters, Sunglass Hut, and Pearl Vision outright, and it manufactures frames under license for major fashion houses including Chanel, Prada, and Giorgio Armani. So when you set those two sets of numbers side by side, a quiet manufacturing town in Jiangsu that most people outside the industry have never heard of, against a nearly $30 billion European giant with global retail dominance, you start to see exactly why this quiet shift matters as much as it does. So where is the actual proof that any of this is genuinely changing the market, rather than just running alongside it without touching it? Start with Danyang International Optical Center and Danyang International Glasses City, two physical marketplaces inside the town where, on a typical weekend, foot traffic can reportedly reach more than 10,000 visitors, a number that local reporting says rivals many recognized tourist attractions in the wider region. People travel from across China specifically to buy a full pair of glasses, frame and prescription lens included, for a fraction of what they would normally pay through a traditional optical retailer back home. $9 complete pairs are not a marketing exaggeration dreamed up for a video script. They are a genuine, common price point inside this ecosystem, made possible because the raw material sourcing, the shaping, the coating, and the frame assembly all happen within the same tightly packed supply chain, with very little markup layered on at each individual step along the way. The proof does not stop at budget frames either, which is what makes this story genuinely interesting rather than just a footnote about cheap manufacturing. In 2026, Danyang hosted what organizers called the China Danyang Optical E-commerce and Smart Glasses Carnival, an event explicitly built around the next generation of eyewear, meaning smart glasses fitted with cameras, microphones, and small built-in displays. Industry coverage has noted that the lens component alone can make up roughly a quarter of the total parts cost inside a modern AI-powered pair of smart glasses. As global technology companies race to build the device many expect to eventually replace the smartphone, they need an enormous, reliable, extremely fast-moving supply chain to actually produce the optical components at real scale on real deadlines. Danyang, sitting on top of 70 years of compounding lens expertise already in place, is positioning itself as exactly that supply chain, not just for affordable reading glasses anymore, but for the sensors, displays, and precision lenses inside the next wave of wearable technology altogether. Direct-to-consumer eyewear brands scattered around the world have quietly leaned on this same manufacturing base for years now, often without ever mentioning it out loud in their own marketing. Budget online glasses retailers that let customers order a full pair of prescription glasses for well under $50 did not invent that pricing out of thin air through clever marketing alone. Much of it traces directly back to exactly this kind of concentrated Chinese manufacturing cluster, where the labor, the specialized tooling, and the sheer density of neighboring factories make it possible to produce a finished pair of glasses at a total cost that would be almost unthinkable inside a fully vertically integrated Western supply chain built the old way. That is the quiet mechanism actually breaking the pricing power of the old monopoly model. Not one single dramatic headline or lawsuit, but millions of individual $9 purchases, quietly adding up year after year across the entire world. What happens once smart glasses become as common as smartphones, and this exact manufacturing base is already sitting there, fully built, ready to supply them at scale? It is worth pausing on just how ordinary this disruption looks from the outside, because that is exactly why it took so long for anyone to notice it happening. Nobody in Danyang held a press conference announcing that they were going to challenge a $30 billion European conglomerate. There was no single dramatic product launch, no viral moment, no headline-grabbing lawsuit. Instead, this happened the way most real industrial shifts actually happen, through thousands of small business owners each solving one narrow problem slightly better and slightly cheaper than the year before, over and over again, for decades, until one day the accumulated effect was simply too large to ignore. A tourist wandering through Danyang International Glasses City on an ordinary Saturday is not thinking about global monopolies at all. They are just thinking that the glasses in front of them are good and cheap and ready to wear home that same afternoon. Multiply that ordinary shopping trip by millions of similar transactions worldwide, and you start to see how quiet, unglamorous manufacturing scale can eventually outmaneuver even the most carefully constructed corporate monopoly. Zoom out far enough, and this stops being a story about the price of glasses at all, and becomes a story about who actually controls a major slice of global consumer technology going forward. For decades, a small handful of Western companies controlled not just how eyewear was physically made, but who got to decide what eyewear looked like, what it cost, and what it was allowed to mean culturally. A Chinese manufacturing cluster capable of producing roughly half the world's lenses changes that balance of power in a very concrete, measurable way, not just a symbolic one. It means smaller, independent eyewear brands anywhere on Earth can now access the same kind of manufacturing scale that used to sit locked behind a handful of vertically integrated giants with decades of infrastructure already built. It means a college student on a tight budget in almost any country can now order stylish, genuinely well-made glasses without paying a heavy luxury markup purely for a recognizable logo stitched onto the arm. And it means the next major hardware wave in consumer technology, smart glasses, already has an enormous, fully built supply chain waiting for it in exactly this one region of China. There is also a national strategy sitting quietly underneath all of this, one that rarely gets mentioned in the same breath as a pair of $9 glasses. Chinese industrial policy over the past decade has repeatedly pushed manufacturing regions to move up the value chain, away from simply assembling cheap goods and toward owning genuine technical expertise in specific, high-value niches. Danyang fits that pattern almost perfectly. It did not stay a low-cost lens grinder forever. It reinvested profits into automation, into lithography equipment, into research partnerships, and into building an export brand that other countries now actively seek out rather than merely tolerate. That is a very different trajectory than simply being a cheap alternative, and it is the exact trajectory that turns a manufacturing town into a long-term strategic asset rather than a temporary cost advantage that could disappear the moment wages rise somewhere else. This fits into a much larger pattern happening across Chinese manufacturing more broadly, where specialized, hyper-concentrated industrial towns come to dominate a single product category the same way Danyang dominates lenses. Shenzhen built that reputation around electronics. Yiwu built it around small household commodities. Wenzhou built it around footwear and eyewear frames. And now Danyang is building it around lenses and, increasingly, the hardware inside smart glasses, all following a remarkably similar playbook of decades of patient, compounding specialization inside one tight geographic cluster. For global brands, this creates a strategic question that used to have an easy, obvious answer and no longer does. Do you keep paying the premium to stay inside the old, vertically integrated, brand-controlled Western system? Or do you shift toward a manufacturing base that can build comparable quality for a fraction of the cost at a speed that is extremely hard to match anywhere else on the planet? Which direction do you think most fashion houses and tech companies will ultimately move in over the next 10 years, once the smart glasses race truly heats up? None of this means the old monopoly model is finished or defeated, and it would not be honest to pretend otherwise just to make a cleaner ending. EssilorLuxottica still controls something Danyang does not fully have yet, which is brand power, built up over decades. A pair of Ray-Bans or Chanel sunglasses is not simply a product, it is a status symbol built through decades of celebrity partnerships, magazine placements, and retail presence inside malls and airports across dozens of countries. Manufacturing capacity alone does not automatically translate into that same kind of cultural weight, and building a globally recognized fashion brand completely from scratch remains its own extremely difficult, expensive challenge, entirely separate from solving the manufacturing side of the equation. There are real risks and genuinely open questions here too, and a balanced look at this story has to include them honestly. Quality control across more than 1,600 separate enterprises operating inside one cluster can vary quite a lot from factory to factory, and cheaper glasses do not always guarantee equally reliable prescriptions or equally durable coatings over time. Counterfeit designer frames remain a real, documented problem in parts of this same broader supply chain, which creates genuine legal risk for both sellers and unsuspecting buyers caught in the middle. Trade tensions and shifting tariffs between China and other major consumer markets could also raise prices or slow down exports at almost any point, since so much of this industry's competitive advantage still depends on smooth, low-friction international shipping routes staying open. And as Danyang itself pushes further into smart glasses and higher-end optical technology, it will increasingly be competing not just on raw price anymore, but on genuine innovation, against companies with far larger dedicated research and development budgets behind them. None of that erases what has already happened inside this one small city, but it does mean the final ending of this particular story has not actually been written yet. It is also worth being honest about scale versus reach, because the two are not quite the same thing. Producing half the world's raw lenses is not the same as controlling half the world's eyewear retail experience, and Danyang, for all its manufacturing power, still largely sells through other people's brands, other people's websites, and other people's stores rather than owning the full relationship with the final customer the way EssilorLuxottica does. That gap between making the product and owning the customer relationship is exactly where the next phase of this competition will likely play out, and it is far from decided yet. Will Chinese manufacturers stay content supplying the raw materials for everyone else's brands, or will more of them push forward into building globally recognized brands of their own, the way certain electronics companies already have? That question alone could shape the next decade of this industry. Here is the core of it, stated as simply as possible. A small city in Jiangsu Province spent 70 patient years quietly building the largest, most specialized eyewear manufacturing cluster on the entire planet. That cluster now produces roughly half of the world's spectacle lenses, and it is doing to the global eyewear industry exactly what cheap, fast, highly coordinated manufacturing has already done to plenty of other industries before it, chipping away, piece by piece, at a locked-in, brand-controlled monopoly, one $9 pair of glasses at a time. If you want to keep seeing how small, largely unnoticed corners of Chinese manufacturing keep quietly reshaping entire industries most people assume are completely untouchable, tapping that subscribe button and turning on notifications means you genuinely will not miss the next one the moment it goes up. So here is a real question worth answering down in the comments below. If a full pair of prescription glasses can already be manufactured for around $9, What exactly do you think you are actually paying for when someone spends $300 or more on a designer pair instead?